Now you've set everything up. Now you're going into the first portion, which is called the oral portion, and it's literally a conversation. Think of it as it's, once all the paperwork is kind of aside, then he's going to kind of jump into starting to ask you questions, and it may be like, he's reading from a sheet and he just asks you this question, that question, this question, that question, or it may be like, hey, so here's a scenario that, we're going to do, and it's going to be, he'll kind of guide you through the scenario based questions. And so it comes off as a little bit more of a conversation. Know that the DPE is not looking to fail you. Generally, there are a few bad apples of DPEs that just, they had a bad day, or they're just, tiny man syndrome or whatever. But generally speaking, DPEs are excited to be a part of your path to success as a pilot. They want to make sure at the end of the day that you are the safest pilot that you possibly can be. Okay. So they're not looking to, oh, I get you. Oh, you don't know this. Oh, there's going to be some grace in their questionings, and they just want to get the warm and fuzzy feelings from you. Would I send my children, would I send my grandmother up with this person, that type of thing. To that end, you also want to be friendly and be pleasant with the DPEs. Be cordial, be nice, treat it almost like a lesson or a ground school, because inevitably every DPE that I have ever come across loves to impart their wisdom and their knowledge. And so sometimes you're going to assuage their ego a little bit and ask, oh, wow, that's really interesting, I had no idea. Or, oh, tell me about that one time that you were doing, X, Y, or Z. So be pleasant to be around, be friendly, be confident, be relaxed as much as you can. I know it's a high stress environment, but at the end of the day, you're talking with a fellow human. They're going to be asking you a whole bunch of like scenario based questions generally. And so they'll give you a scenario. All right, I want to take, this person from this, area to that area. How do I do that? And so what they'll do oftentimes at the beginning is ask very high level questions. And then it's like, well, there's going to be 13 different parts to answering what he's, asking. And so what you can ask is to funnel these questions down into specific things. Like, well, could you tell me what you're really looking for? Or what do you mean by this? And you want to ask clarifying questions to get the examiner to ask very specific questions. And then you provide the answer sufficient to meet those requirements. Short answers are better. So less is more. Don't volunteer information. Be specific. Answer. The duration of the answer itself should be sufficient to answer his question, but provide no more. If he wants more, he'll ask. If not, then he'll assume that you know everything about that subject area because you satisfied that one specific key phrase or the thing that he was looking for, that type of thing. I had a wonderful examiner for the first few number of check rides that had a very thick accent. And there was a number of times that I genuinely couldn't understand the words that he was saying. Like I kind of understood, like, I think we're talking about this, but I'm like, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? And he used to get a little frustrated with me because I couldn't understand. But if you don't understand, just ask for clarification or ask for, can you rephrase that question in a different manner until you understand exactly what they're going for. Keep in mind, questions are going to be large in scope when you first start out, and then they're going to get very narrow. And you're going to get that narrowness, if you will, by asking clarification questions. If you are asked a question and you're not 100% sure, always err on the side of conservative or safe, meaning how in this scenario that he has provided, how can I be conservative? How can I be safe? How can I give this examiner the warm and fuzzies? Here are some key things to study or memorize prior to going to the check ride. Okay. How systems work. You don't have to understand at an engineering level on how to recreate or build an electrical system in a helicopter, but you have to know the voltage. You have to know, like, how does the power come in? Where is the power generated from? Like, kind of the big issues of the electrical system. But you need to know that for all of the systems, whether it's the electrical system or the environmental system or fuel systems, whatever. So know how the systems work. Limitations and emergency procedures you must memorize. Because we're flying helicopters and it requires, more often than not, two hands to fly, we're going to have to memorize a lot of the emergency procedures. So I know that in the event of an engine failure, down, right, aft, in a Robinson, and I have to memorize certain things because I'm not going to be able to pull out the emergency procedures checklist and say, oh, okay, I need to do this. You memorize the limitation sections and the emergency procedures sections. And there's going to be sometimes some portions of emergency procedures that are going to be memorized, and then you can reference the checklist. So memorize the first 4 steps, and then the remainder 3 steps are going to be, oh, okay, you can pull out the checklist and do these things. So the better understanding you have of memorizing every single step for every single emergency procedure is going to do you well. Okay, so systems, limitations, emergency procedures, VFR weather minimums, class, B, class C, class D, class E, daytime, nighttime, like memorize all of those. And it's going to be like a little, cheat sheet card that we provided in the course, but you need to memorize those. The weather minimums may not be solo or by themselves, just off the cuff. It may be as part of a scenario-based question that he's going to ask you, or they're going to ask you. Also going to be questions about METARs and TAFs. And examiners are old. I don't mean that disparagingly, but they had to, and myself included, had to learn how to read and decode a METAR and a TAF or an area forecast in the shorthand. Even though that was set up for the dial-up modems in that area, we have the ability now to have decoded METARs. In fact, when you get a standard weather briefing, they'll tell you in plain English that winds are 270 at 14, gusting 27, whatever it is. Expect to decode a METAR and a TAF or a TAF. I mean, the decoding of the METAR and TAF are going to be the same acronyms for each. It's just the time format, right? Okay, so you need to understand Zulu time, and then what airspace you're flying in, or what time zone that you're flying in, and how to then infer, like, okay, this METAR is how old, this TAF is for what time to what time, that type of thing. The next one is going to be regulations, what you can do and what you can't do as a pilot. So when you're going for your private pilots, what you are able to do, how are you able to take passengers? Can they pay? How often do you have, what is currency? What is proficiency? All of those things. So regulations, at least a good understanding, and then what we're prohibited from doing, and then what we're required for doing. Like if, let's say there's an incident or an accident, NTSB 830, specifies the definition of an accident or an incident, and then the immediate notification requirements, or the notify within so many days. So all of those regulations of the things we can do, things we can't do, and things we must do. And then there's also going to be chart-based questions. So literally they're going to pull out a big chart on the table, and they're going to point to this. Okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? And then they're going to incorporate the airspace, understanding of the airspace within that chart. They're going to say, okay, if I was over this point at 1,000 feet, what airspace am I in? If I was over that point at 2,000 feet, what airspace am I in? In that airspace that I'm in, Class C airspace or whatever, what are the VFR weather minimums? All right, if I'm over this point at this altitude, what airspace am I in? What are the VFR weather minimums? What are the restrictions to enter Bravo? All of those things. So they're going to use the chart as, okay, here's the nav, here's along the route. What airspace is this? What does this mean? What does that mean? So there's going to be a period of time for that. Okay. So that covers kind of airspace, and then also like VFR weather minimums themselves. Okay. And then there's going to be like aeromedical questions, things like what is hypoxia? How about the DECIDE model, or what is the I'm safe checklist? Things like that from the aeromedical study sheets. Okay. And then in addition to that is going to be like definitions of nighttime, the evening civil twilight, the sunset, 1 hour after sunset. Like, what does that mean? Like, when can you start logging night? When is it actually night? When, all of those things. Okay. And then finally, I think we harped on it already, but it's the currency versus proficiency. That is the oral portion. That's going to be kind of a scenario-based guided discussion question. And so again, the examiner's looking to test your knowledge in certain areas. And if you are found sufficient, he may not dig deeper. But if you are not confident in your answers and you're like, well, I think it's this, then he's going to be like, well, tell me more. And then they're going to dive deeper into that area. Let's just use the fuel system as an example. It's like, okay, do we have fuel pumps on this, helicopter? And if the answer is no, and you're like, well, I don't think so, then it's going to be like, okay, well, how does fuel get from the fuel tanks to the carburetor? And so he's going to start diving into that system a little bit more. Whereas if he asks you, do we have any fuel pumps, you can say no, it's a gravity fed system, or whatever your helicopter is. I just use that as an example. So that confidence in your answer also kind of says, oh, okay, he understands this system. And to some extent, I hate saying this, but to some extent, the examiner's there to kind of check the boxes, making sure that he feels confident in your knowledge of the fuel system, or in your knowledge of that kind of broad system itself. So if you are showing a lack of knowledge or a lack of confidence, that's what he's thinking. He's like, okay, he's not confident, so he doesn't really know.